Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a blog post by Chinese author and blogger Li Chengpeng.
Okay.
The title is a little bit of a mouthful. It's Hucham Yukufa, which translates to, "You see the sand grouse flying all over the sky? This is the times."
Wow.
Quite a title, right?
Yeah, it really is. It's certainly grabs your attention.
It does, and it kind of sets the stage for what Li's trying to say here.
It does. There's a lot packed into that image of sand grouse.
Yeah.
You know, these birds that you don't usually see in Beijing suddenly appearing in droves.
Right.
It's traditionally seen as a sign of unrest, things being out of balance.
Yeah.
And Li uses this as a starting point to explore some of the anxieties and tensions he's observing in China today.
Yeah, and he doesn't just leave it hanging in the title.
Right.
He kind of weaves it throughout the whole post, connecting it to real events that really drive home his point.
Yeah.
One that really stuck with me was the story out of Guidong about the 55-year-old man who was struggling to survive on welfare.
Right.
He was found to have 20,000 yuan, which is roughly 2,800 US dollars.
Okay.
In savings, and because of that tiny amount, his benefits were revoked.
And that led to just a horrible tragedy.
Yeah.
He ended up taking the life of the social worker who investigated him before taking his own life.
Yeah,
And what I find so unsettling about this story is the contrast.
Yeah.
You have this man who's punished for having a little bit of savings, trying to create some kind of security for himself.
Right.
While we know that there are high-ranking officials who have amassed fortunes through corruption.
Exactly. And it makes you question, like, the fairness of the system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It raises questions about, you know, where is the justice in that?
Yeah, Lemon brings up another example, the recent trial of Sun Zigang, who was a former party secretary in Guizhou province.
Yeah.
Sun was found guilty of embezzling a staggering amount of money.
Oh, yeah. A huge amount.
Over 813 million yuan. Which is over 113 million US dollars.
It's hard to even fathom that.
Over a decade. And yet, there he is in court expressing remorse.
It makes you wonder, how much of that remorse is genuine?
Right.
Versus, you know, a calculated move in a system where even with that level of corruption, the consequences might be relatively light.
Especially when you compare it to the desperation of the man in Kidang.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like two different sets of rules.
Yeah, and it's like Li's getting at this growing sense of discontent among the people in China.
Yeah, and it's not just discontent, it's leading to some pretty disturbing trends.
Right, he talks about a worrying trend of violence against officials.
He does. He cites some really chilling incidents. The murder of a judge in Henan, the kidnapping of a finance official in Hunan.
Right.
It's unsettling, but he connects it to this sense of desperation among people. Like they're feeling so unheard, so ignored by the system that they're resorting to these extreme measures.
Which is where his comparison to the late Ming Dynasty comes in. You know, I'll admit, when I first read that, I thought, whoa, that's a big jump.
Right. It seems like a stretch at first.
Yeah, but the more you think about it,
the more the parallels start to emerge.
Right.
The Ming Dynasty ultimately crumbled under a combination of pressures. Widespread social unrest, severe economic inequality, rampant corruption within the government.
Yeah.
And these are all issues that Li's seeing bubbling up in China today.
So is he saying that China is on the verge of collapse?
I don't think he's necessarily saying that, but he's definitely using history as a warning.
Right.
He seems to be urging those in power to, you know, recognize these signs and take action before it's too late.
And he backs this up with some pretty concrete examples of the economic struggles people are facing, like the sharp drop in restaurant profits, which in a culture where food is so central is definitely a red flag.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
He even mentions this almost absurd story of a bottle of Sprite being auctioned off for a fraction of its price because the company went bankrupt.
Wow.
It paints a picture of an economy teetering on the edge.
Yeah, like things are unraveling.
Yeah.
And then there's this curious trend of university students putting up portraits of Mao Zedong in their dorms.
Right. At first glance, you might think it's a resurgence of Maoist ideology.
Right, you would think that.
But Leia offers a more nuanced interpretation.
It's not as simple as it seems.
Right.
He suggests that for some, it's a nostalgia. For simpler, more egalitarian past.
Right.
But for others, it could be a sign of class conflict brewing. And it's that ambiguity, that uncertainty about what it really means that adds to this feeling of unease he's describing.
Then to lighten the mood a bit,
Okay.
he throws in this darkly humorous anecdote about a con man who's selling useless flea medicine to a desperate village.
Oh, wow.
What I found interesting is how he links it to this growing skepticism people feel toward the government's proposed solution.
This brilliant use of satire.
Yeah.
You had these villagers who are so desperate for relief that they'll believe anything. And this charlatan exploits that.
Yeah.
And Lean seems to be implying that that same dynamic is at play on a larger scale.
Right.
People are losing faith in the leadership, doubting their ability or even their willingness to address the real problems.
And that leads to what I found to be one of the most powerful sections of his post.
Okay.
The stories about delivery workers. These are the people who, in many ways, are the backbone of China's economy. Yeah. Especially its booming e-commerce and delivery industries.
Right.
But he highlights two tragic cases. A delivery worker in Chengdu who died from a brain hemorrhage.
Oh, God.
And another in Hangzhou who was found dead on his electric bike. And these stories are just a stark reminder of the human cost of this always-on gig economy.
Especially in a country that once prided itself on, having these incredibly efficient delivery services.
Exactly. It makes you wonder about the pressures these workers are facing, the lack of support, and ultimately the tragic consequences.
It speaks to that larger theme of discontent.
Yeah.
This feeling that people are being squeezed, exploited, and forgotten, even as the country projects this image of success.
And then he touches on something that's so relevant today, the increasing surveillance, particularly in schools. He even mentions the potential for microchips.
Wow.
To be implanted in school uniforms.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel.
Right.
This constant monitoring, erosion of privacy, even in places like schools. It's pretty chilling.
It is, and it really raises these questions about the direction China is headed.
Yeah, where are the lines?
The balance between security and individual freedom.
That's Zach.
It's a lot to unpack, and we've really only just scratched the surface here.
We have.
But before we go any further, I want to just take a moment to let all this sink in. What are your initial thoughts? What's resonating with you the most so far?
Well, I think. Yeah. What strikes me is how Li is able to connect all these different events. The tragedy in Qidong, the corruption case, the violence against officials, and weave them into this bigger story of a sand grouse era. It's not just about economics or politics. It's about this deeper feeling that something's not right. The system itself is off balance.
Like those sand grouse showing up in Beijing. Yeah, it's a sign that something's off. And it's interesting that Li doesn't come right out and call for revolution or regime change.
Yeah.
It's more like he's appealing to this shared anxiety. Like he's saying, hey, we all see this, right? We all feel it.
Right, and I think that's what makes his writing so powerful. He's not just reporting on events, he's capturing a mood. Yeah. A feeling that I think resonates with a lot of people in China right now. And he's also not afraid to use humor to critique those in power. Yeah. Like that story about the flea medicine.
It's funny, but it also has this bite to it. Like, are you serious? This is the best you can do.
Exactly. He's pointing out how absurd some of the solutions are. The disconnects between the elite and what people are actually dealing with every day. And it's not just economic policies. He's critical of the increasing social control, the surveillance, the way dissent is being stifled, that whole thing about microchips in school uniforms. It's almost Orwellian.
Yeah, it makes you think about how much security is too much. What are we giving up in the name of safety? Like, doesn't really offer any answers. But he does leave us with this thought-provoking question, can China escape this sand grouse era? Or in history just going to repeat itself?
And I think that question goes beyond China. We see signs of social and economic instability in a lot of parts of the world. The rise of populism, eroding trust in institutions, the gap between the rich and the poor widening. These are all sand grouse in their own way.
So what does this mean for us? I mean, we're not in China. We're not experiencing these exact same things. But are there sand grouse in our own skies? What are the things that make us uneasy? The things that make us think maybe something is not quite right in our own societies?
I think that's the real takeaway here. Li's urging us to look at our own systems and ask ourselves the tough questions. Where are the cracks? What are the signs that things might be going in a dangerous direction?
It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day. Just push those uneasy feelings aside. But Li's post is a reminder that we can't afford to do that.
We have to pay attention. We have to be willing to speak up, to hold those in power accountable, to fight for a better future where everyone has a chance to thrive, not just survive.
And I think it starts with paying attention to the stories that aren't being told, to the people who are being ignored, to the sand grouse in our own backyards.
Exactly, because if we don't learn from history, we're bound to repeat it.
Yeah.
And that's a cycle we can't afford to keep going.
Lanes talks about how people's reactions to hardship have changed. He says it's gone from kneeling and begging to jumping off buildings in despair, and now we're seeing this trend of violence against officials.
It's a stark progression, a sign of how desperate people are becoming. When they feel like they have no voice, no other options, they lash out. And that lashing out isn't always physical. Lees talks about the rise of nationalism, hostility towards anyone who's different, even how people attack each other online.
It's like this toxic mix of anger, fear, resentment. And it reminds me of other times in history, like pre-World War II Japan, where all that social and economic unrest led to militarism and ultimately to catastrophe.
Right, but the thing is, historical parallels are tricky. They don't always play out the same way. We have a choice. We can choose to face these problems head on, or we can ignore them and risk making the same mistakes again.
One story that stuck with me was Lee's description of officials during the fall of the Ming Dynasty. He talks about how these officials who had sworn loyalty to the emperor suddenly switched sides when it became clear the rebels were going to win. They literally burned their official robes and scrambled to find costumes so they could pretend to be commoners.
It's almost funny in a dark way. It shows how shallow their loyalty really was.
And what's interesting is how he compares that to how ordinary people were acting back then. He says they were more resigned, like they knew what was coming but couldn't do anything to stop it.
Like that calm before the storm.
Yeah.
It brings us back to his image of the sandgrass. You know, these birds showing up as a sign that something is deeply wrong. But people are just going about their business, buying and selling them. Like everything's fine.
It's like they're in denial, wanting to believe that everything's okay even when it's not. It reminds me of that saying about the frog in boiling water. It doesn't realize the water's getting hotter until it's too late.
Exactly. And that's what Lee's warning us about. We need to be aware. We need to speak up. We need to demand better from our leaders. Because history shows us what happens when societies ignore the needs of their people.
So back to Lee's question. Can China escape the sandgrouse era?
And, while he's focusing on China, I think what he's saying has implications for all of us. We talked about Japan earlier. But we see similar things happening all over the world. The rise of populism, people losing trust in their institutions, the growing gap between the rich and the poor. These are all sandgrouse in their own right.
So what does this mean for us? What are the things that make us uneasy, that suggest something might be off balance in our own societies?
That's the question Lee's asking us to think about. He doesn't give us the answers, but he's pushing us to be critical thinkers, to question our assumptions, to look beyond the surface.
To be active participants, not just passive bystanders, to understand that the choices we make, the actions we take can make a difference. Even small acts of resistance, speaking out, demanding better, they can all contribute to change.
It's a call to action, but also a call to awareness, to pay attention to what's happening around us, to the currents of history, to the sandgrouse that might be telling us things are changing. Because the sandgrouse era isn't just happening in China, it's a global phenomenon.
It's a wake-up call for all of us. And the question is, how are we going to answer?
And if we don't, learn from what's happened before, we're just going to keep repeating the same mistakes.
It's a scary thought, right? So as you go about your day, just kind of keep your eyes open.
Yeah.
Look for those subtle changes, those little whispers that something's not quite right.
Right.
Listen to the stories of people who are struggling, who are being pushed aside. What are the sandgrouse moments in your own life, in your community, in your country?
Yeah. Are there things that people are trying to hide? Are there voices being shut down? Are there systems that aren't working for the people they're supposed to help? I think these are the questions that Lee's blog is really making us confront.
And he doesn't give us any easy answers, which I think is part of the point.
Yeah.
He's not telling us what to think, but he's showing us how to think,
Right. He's encouraging us to be critical, to question what we think we know, to look deeper.
To really participate and not just sit back and watch. To understand that our choices matter, what we do has an impact. Even small acts of speaking out, demanding better, they can all add up to something bigger.
It's a call to action, but it's also a call to just be aware of what's happening around you, to the currents of history, to the sandgrouse that might be telling us things are shifting. Because this sandgrouse era isn't just happening in China, it's a global thing.
It's a wake-up call for all of us, and the question is, how are we going to answer it? That's something for us all to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dives into Li Chingping's blog post. We hope it's given you some new ideas and maybe even made you feel a little uncomfortable in a good way. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.